Hi there, this is Josh from Literary Gladiators, and today we are going to be going into the vault. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the best books that I read in 2008. 2008 was a significant year for my reading because this is the first year that I got into reading in a way that was more critical, and I started to evaluate more of what it was that I read. That's when I started doing book reviews. Technically, it was in late 2007, but not enough to really put anything together. But this is where I started reading more chapter books. I started reading more widely. I started reading more fiction, because up until that point, most of my reading was nonfiction in areas of interest, and they were more reference than anything. And I would dip in and out of things based off of what it is that I had the mood into reading. But if you check out the thumbnail, I am only holding up 9 books, but there are 10 books to the list because that's how many of the books I have within reach, within reasonable reach. The way that I'm going to approach this list is going to be a bit more anecdotal than it is going to be specific. But I have some of these books, it's been 16 years since I read them, so I'll tell you about what I recall and how it made me feel, because that's what has stuck with me throughout this time. This is me looking back, so that's going to be the way that I approach this. But let's get right into things. Number 10 on my list is Cujo by Stephen King. I read this around the springtime. This is actually a copy that my sister acquired. My sister wanted to get into Stephen King, and this is where she decided to begin. She really wasn't a fan of it, and so she let me borrow it, and once I was done, she let me keep it. But Cujo is the first dive that I took as far as his specifically horror books are concerned, because I did read his Renaissance works of the later 90s, which had aspects of horror, but they had literary undertones to them too. This is direct horror. Even though I did read Salem's Lot in middle school, but I think that I got a greater understanding for it when I read it again in 2017. But back to Cujo, this one really made me feel raw and empty upon concluding. Cujo was a rabid St. Bernard dog, and he was quite horrifying. And it was just that sense of what he did, the horrors and the claustrophobia, really made this a horrifying read. And that's what I remember getting out of it. Number 9 on my list is one that is the one that I don't have within reasonable reach. It may be buried somewhere, or because I remember my copy was being passed around, and that's The Shack by William Paul Young, and it has to do with the author recalling a friend of his that went through the traumatic experience of having his child kidnapped, raped, and killed, and the crisis that he went into that eventually led to him meeting up with God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and what it was that he got out of that. And depending on your faith and your beliefs, it's labeled as a work of fiction, but it is all in the eye of who it is that's reading. My grandfather was the one that read it first. He passed it on to my grandmother. Other members of my family did read it. My mother, me, my sister, my dad. Even though my dad really could not stand the book. I don't know what to think about it now. Back then it really stuck out in my mind. Not to the point that it was the most amazing thing that I read, but it was an interesting approach. I think that one thing that really sticks out looking back is that when they adapted into a film, they had Octavia Butler playing the role of God. The one that I had in mind when I read the book was Viola Davis, who was her co-star in The Help. So it's quite interesting how that was handled. But moving right along to number 8, my number 8 pick of that year was Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. This is the prequel to The Da Vinci Code, even though this really started to pick up attention because of the film release of The Da Vinci Code. This is the first adventure featuring Robert Langdon, who is a symbologist, and it deals with his work as far as solving cases involving the Catholic Church, which we see that in the first 2 books of the series. Those that are reading this should just be taking it for its entertainment value. The different aspects as far, if you're reading this thinking that this is going to be true, it's not, because Dan Brown himself said it wasn't. He just flip-flopped on the basis that people were actually taking it seriously. But for an adventure piece, this is really enthralling. This and the Da Vinci Code, which I read the year after, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more. But after I finished reading this, I let my mother borrow it, and this is what she did. My mother is known for breaking spines. This is how my sister handles a book, and this is how I handle a book. My books, I'm generally good with being able to preserve the basic state of the book. I'm not always perfect, but I do my best. But I was still engaged, and I think that I didn't think the film was all that great. It wasn't faithful to this book. This book was really enthralling and very engaging. I can definitely remember that from that. But number 7 on my list is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. It was just the next book that I could show you, and it was a good example of that demonstration. But to me, and to this day, Pet Sematary is the scariest Stephen King novel that I've ever read. It was it did have that raw and what felt like empty moments, and we're introduced to these characters and only to have everything unravel the way that it did. It really stuck with me as far as that was concerned. I could remember, I read this in the summer of 2008, and I remember bringing it to a doctor's appointment that I accompanied my grandparents on one of their doctor's appointments, and while they were in the office, I was in the waiting room reading this book. Number 6 on my list is Kiss the Girls by James Patterson. This is the second book in the Alex Cross series. I'll have to be honest with you, there's only so much that I can recall, primarily basic details. But I can remember that I was engaged in this piece, and I enjoyed it uh, just as much as I did Along Came a Spider. I will say that Along Came a Spider was a little bit better, but still, I think that this really kept things going on a good note. It's unfortunate that it's been 14 years since I've read anything by James Patterson. I do need to get back into it, and I might have to do some slight rereading. Maybe I'll get the hang of things as I continue with his other works, and in particular the Alex Cross series, because I think that's his strongest. I mean, that is where he authentically writes the works himself. He generally doesn't have a co-author when he does Alex Cross. Number 5 on my list is Bag of Bones by Stephen King from 2008. I read this. This is probably the first book that I read as I made my way through faithful reading, except maybe The Green Mile. But I remember taking this on a trip up to Liberty Science Center with my grandparents, my sister, and my cousin. And I finished it, I was reading it on the car ride to, from, and then I finished it when I got back to their house. But this is an example of the brilliance of the late 90s renaissance of Stephen King, which has to do with Mike Noonan. He's a writer. He deals with moments of horror, primarily the encounters that he has with ghosts, but it also deals with him losing his wife and him having an impact on those around him, and the direct impact that he had in one particular case. I just felt really immersed and engaged as I read this book. Number 4 on my list is Hanukkah Guilt by Eileen Schneider. Eileen Schneider is Ari, who's my friend and fellow Gladiator's mom. I read this in the summer of 2008, and this has to do with Rabbi Aviva Cohen, who solves mysteries. It's such a cozy idea, which is exactly where she's trying to get at. One may think, what is a rabbi doing getting into the business of those that should be of things that should be solved by detectives and forensic scientists and investigators, law enforcement, but this seems to pay off. I think that this really seems to work out well, and the one thing that really stuck out was the character of her nephew, Josh. Her sister and her sister's wife had a son named Josh who had Asperger's syndrome. So it really seemed to, I really seemed to see the connection there. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that that we share the same name and the same condition, and I think he was written very well. I would say that I would be watching more of just the general Thomas the Tank Engine videos rather than Thomas and the Magical Railroad, because I did only watch it once and I wasn't too fond of it, to be honest. But I think nevertheless, I thought that this was a book that really kicked off a very enthralling series. And it also gives you a greater, more lighthearted depth in the knowledge about Judaism, which I always am eager to learn more about. Number 3 on my list is Hold Tight by Harlan Coben. And I acquired this when Harlan Coben came to speak at the Ocean County Library. I even got the book signed, which I thought Harlan Coben was really cool. I liked his analogies on what the writing process is like. He was very knowledgeable and encouraging as far as being a writer and encouraging others to get into writing is concerned. This book was just a prime example of what he can put together. And he is excellent when it comes to the thriller aspect and the twists and turns that come with being a thriller writer. Number 2 on my list is Along Came a Spider by James Patterson. Along Came a Spider is the first book in the Alex Cross series, and it is the first James Patterson book that I read, and it made me an enthusiast for what he can do. There are things that James Patterson does that I'm not necessarily a fan of, but this is him in his greatest medium, and he introduces Alex Cross and puts him in a very intense but roller coaster ride of a story. Introduces a great protagonist with great depth, a very lovable family, a very immoral antagonist, and twists and turns that a thriller really deserves. And the number 1 book on my list, the best book that I read in 2008, was Tell No One by Harlan Coben, which to this day is still one of the best books that I ever read. I picked this up when I learned that Harlan Coben was going to come and speak at the library. This is his oldest standalone book, and it's just so enriching because it has to do with Dr. Beck whose wife is taken away and disappears. Then he gets a personal email that he finds out that she's not gone and that she's still around, and he just needs to find her. And this book is just filled with so many twists, turns, moments of suspense. It was just so engaging. This is something I really genuinely didn't want to put down. So these are many of the books that I read and enjoyed in 2008. My reading only became more prosperous as time went by. I explored more authors, returned to favorites, but this is where everything started, and I'm going to be sharing videos for the next 4 years in upcoming videos. You can find my other From the Vaults from 2013 and 2014, and then it was in 2015 where I started putting together top 10 lists for the channel. It's probably my favorite kind of video to put together, and I love at the end of the year when I get to rank what it is that I read. And I love top 10 lists too, and countdowns at that. Thank you for tuning into this video. I hope you check out some more videos from our channel, and for now, keep reading.